Hi, Dyslexic Genius here. I'm back on the Brunswick motor and finished it, and I want to talk about a few things. The first thing is some motors are like Marianne, and then number two is like Raquel Welch, and number three, hard to do. Yeah, this was a Stormy Daniels. But because of the springs, and sometimes you get in there in the spring barrel, and yes, the nipple was bad, but they both didn't still want to hook up. And I had to look and look, and I played around with it. And I found out that the center spring barrel, where the arbor hooks up, was just kicked a little bit, slightly. So I came in with my big needle nose pliers, and I bent it around so it would hook up.
The spring.
The spring. After assembly and doing everything, I've changed a few things on this motor because it's steel here, which if you have a steel top and a steel bearing right here, this one right here, it's kind of a galling effect. So I changed the oil on this because of that, and I'll talk about that. The first thing is these motors are absolutely dead silent. So let's get into the product I used for assembly. What I used was Permatex Slick 50 engine assembly lube, and I talked about that before. It's between sewing machine oil and STP, and this really helps it. And it doesn't.
And where did you put that?
I put that at the end of this spindle shaft right here. I did it here, here, and here, and also on the bottom where those run in. Sewing machine oil, I only used the spindle shaft right down here and underneath. Sewing machine oil here and here on the governor. Sewing machine oil on the felt right here. You want to make sure this is wet with sewing machine oil. You know, it's damp. You can take a little here and you can literally fill the thing up. You can see how that goes at, and it's just going to suck it in there, and it'll help make the motor run. I put super lube on this. I polished out all the bearings and everything. And this machine has like 1.25 inch springs. So, and they're 28 thousandths of thickness, which means you have a lot of torque on it. But to get the power out of these two springs on this motor, they're not going to fire up 3 or 4 or 5 times. You really got to crank this thing up to really get the power out of the motor. And then it will run forever once you get it cranked up. And now, if you turn it on, it's really silent. Remember, we had the eccentric bearings. We had to adjust all that to have the shaft here run into the governor drive gear right here, and we got that to run smoothly. I also used on the motor my green grease graphite mix right here, the little Starbucks stopper. I've talked about that before. I'm running it on the spindle shaft gear back on it here and on this gear, and I put a light coating on the bottom gear here that runs the spring barrels. The bottom one here, I didn't coat those because it doesn't turn all the time like this top gear. You can see this top gear is running. This doesn't run around and around and around. But on the back end here, the winding crank mechanism, I put the green grease graphite in here also to help it. You don't need a lot, but when you look in here at the gear, you can, down in here, you can see that it's covered with the graphite green grease and it's running. And also back up in here on the spindle shaft drive gear, you can see that it's running. And you have the coating. You see the coating. You don't need to pack it on. It needs just a little bit. And this thing had a lot of grease.
Now, are there any fiber gears on this one?
There's a fiber gear on this gear right here. It's between 2 pieces of brass. That's how they did it.
So that you don't put anything there? Oil in there?
Only thing I use is the super lube on that, which is fine. And somebody else has been in here, and the reason I can tell is that this cotter key right here was changed. This should be a dark black cotter key, and that's a new modern cotter key. So somebody had been in here and tried to fix things, and I think they messed it up. We also changed we had to tap and put in new screws that hold the gears onto the spring barrels. And what's the nice thing about it, the new screws I use kind of match these top ones, so it looks pretty. I hope you enjoyed the video on this Brunswick motor. Nice little motors, they run, but sometimes these things are a bummer or a bee to put together, and they don't want to, arbors don't want to hook up, and you play with them and take them apart. And literally, I had the spring barrels in and out probably 4 or 5 times to get them to hook up. Once you get them hooked up and you crank it and you go, okay, it's hooked up, that's when you shut the motor off and you crank it up all the way till it stops. And what you're doing is you're bending that spring around that arbor when you crank it up all the way. So on this one, I did maybe 20 cranks. I lifted up this, said it's running, and I went all the way, tightened it up, and then I just keep, every time I crank it, I ran it all the way to the end so it would tighten up around that arbor. And there you go. If you have one of these motors and you have it in your phonograph, always crank them all the way up. You don't have to all the way to the end, but you want it really heavy so you're using all the spring. And then when you're done, let it run down. You won't have any problems. And that's my tip for the day.